him recently, is poised to become the next American Julius Caesar, and what exactly that Caesarism, if it happens to happen, would mean for the rest of the United States. Is the Republic lost? All of that. So we're going to be getting in on that with three returning champions of BTR. We've got Uberboyo, we've got Armand all the way from San Francisco, who was recently here for a debate about Joseph Biden with Sticks Hexenhammer 666. Be sure to check that one out. And we got the great Drutang coming in live. And Uberboyo, I don't know, we should probably start with Armand actually before getting to you. Because Armand, you are a Democrat. You've been a big part of supporting, Joseph Biden, before a lot of these things have been occurring. I don't know what your thoughts are on him at the moment, but in general, you have been more of a proponent of more of the mainstream system that we've had as far as the Democrats go, and even some of the Republicans that may not turn you off as much, let's say. You are not a big fan of the MAGA movement. You're not a big fan of some of the people we've started coming here seeing. So it would be interesting to kind of get your opinion on what you see within the system that a lot of these populist types happen to go against. And then I would like to see if this compares with some of the pre-Caesar Roman Republic conditions that Uberboyo was alluding to, and then I definitely want to get Drew's take on that. But before we get started, everybody comment, subscribe, need those super chats, you know what to do. So anyway, Armand, go ahead, brother.
Okay. Well, so first of all, I would say that I'm not necessarily so much a pro system person as I think that you can't everyone actually is part or trying to modify the system. I
Sure.
just think that a lot of the posturing around whether it's MAGA people or people on further left who are claiming that they're anti-system and there's a system against them. It's I don't know, especially as I've become more involved in Democratic Party politics. It's I was just talking to my brother about this the other day. He's like, I don't know what the powers that be are orchestrating. I'm like, I wish the powers that be were that competent. It's a mess. Everybody's a mess. Everybody's trying to figure it out. There are emergent orders and so on, and people are trying to make things work. And definitely people want to change things dramatically. But I would say one of my primary frustrations with the MAGA movement is that I think a lot of it is fake. It's people who are saying they're against corporate elites, and then they massively cut taxes for corporations. They just had Sean O'Brien speaking from the Teamsters, which is oh wow, they're saying that they're pro-labor, but if you look at the voting record of JD Vance, 100% against all of labor's priorities, and so I think it's a lot fraudulent. But to sort of steer back to the topic of I guess American Caesar or Caesarism or so on, and the analogies in the Roman Republic, I think a similar analogy is that part of the reason that Caesar was able to break through. It's because the institutions of Rome and the Republic had become ossified for a long time. There's a lot of paralysis, an enormous amount of corruption, and people were very frustrated by it, and it created an opening for a strong, charismatic figure to try to, that's historically been a lot what's happened. Do that with, not. I know people get very especially in these spaces, get very when you compare Trump to Hitler, they get very mad. Putting aside whether you think he is or not, just from a historical perspective, if people the way that authoritarians often come into power is that there's a foundation of frustration of the existing system, and people feel like a strong figure of a decisive presence can cut through the existing corruption anymore. And I think in particular, that was Trump's really promise in 2016. I think it showed when he was 2016 to 2020 that is not true. And the stuff that the result that he really tried to cut through is on his own behalf. I do think now he has a much larger movement behind him and has a lot more institutional support. Project 2025 has built sort of a large army of people who are very much vetted for support. Their plans laid out for using Schedule F to fire appointees. And if you like him and you like his ideas, that could be very promising. If you don't like his ideas, there's also a little bit scary, especially particularly that the Supreme Court has sort of expanded his scope of what he can do that's considered like an official act and is protected legally. He's specifically committed to like pardoning um, people who, like, for example, he plans to have this mass wave of deportations in the very beginning. And a lot of the strategy basically, because it's like last time they did it and the court stopped, and the strategy is like push as hard as you can before the court stop you, and like we'll give you pardons, so don't worry if you like commit crime. And just all of that, I think, adds up to the potential for American Caesar.
Hmm. Well, as far as immigration and deportation and all of that, I want to get Uberboyo in here right now, because if you guys go to Uberboyo's Twitter, X, whatever, you're going to see a wonderfully articulate post about this coming Caesarism, and specifically aspects related to migration and comparing what was going on in the Roman Republic at the time. So, Steph, let me know what exactly you're seeing from that point of view, and how exactly you would describe some connection with the system that we have right now versus the system back then.
Well, obviously I'm Irish, so it's not really, I haven't got much investment in what goes on over in America, much less in terms of power. So it's just about observing it from a distance, and obviously observing history from a distance.
Speaking of observing from a distance, Steph is currently walking around. So
history is, as Nietzsche said,
Steph, we are not hearing you that well, I'm afraid, brother, so you're going to have to go somewhere where the audio is going to be good. While you're doing that, though, I want to hand it over to Drew. Drew, I know you didn't write that post, but you are talking about Donald Trump as a Caesar-type figure from a different point of view, as far as what may be lurking in the shadows of some higher repeating patterns and all of that, things related to spirituality. But if you were to kind of take the reins for a moment, as far as the kind of things that Steph alludes to when it comes to this incoming Caesarism in the face of what Armand has also talked about being this dysfunctional system that we're in, do you see similarities between that dysfunctional system in our current year and what's been going on and what was going on in the Roman Republic?
Yeah, I mean, there's general, there are a lot of similarities, and it's kind of been a meme recently. How often do you think about the Roman Empire or whatever, was like a TikTok meme recently. And, obviously there's some parallels you can draw, overexpanded military where, our empire is so big that now we're fighting, we're essentially fighting two wars on two fronts right now. And if, say, for instance, China was to try and take Taiwan, we're running pretty low on weapons and resources. So you could see a parallel
For the record,
there.
by the way, I don't think about the Roman Empire every day. I think about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And I mean, just
Hell yeah.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No,
No,
which should be making a comeback, hopefully, with what's going on with Russia right now. But that's a whole other, yeah.
But yeah, so that's one thing in terms of the parallels, and I just wanted to address, I think, kind of what you were saying originally, Armand, about the DNC and it, not being organized, or structures in general, the establishment not being organized. Just to give a little intro into my personal politics, is the only time I voted was in 2016 for Jill Stein, because I was too distraught from. I was a big Bernie bro, and the DNC, could have had me as a Democrat for life, but they decided to systematically rig the entire primary process against Bernie Sanders, the superdelegate system notwithstanding. But through the WikiLeaks emails, them, clearly exposing themselves as not being impartial, as they claim to be, and in the end, rigging it pretty hard in terms of, or in favor of, Hillary Clinton. And then not apologizing, Debbie Wasserman Schultz steps down as the head of the DNC, and then Hillary Clinton immediately hires her onto her campaign. There's no real apology. They just kind of sweep it under the rug, and then kind of used it to start the whole Russiagate bullshit. So yeah, that's just a background on my personal politics. And I didn't vote for Trump in 2020. I don't plan to vote for him I don't plan to vote at all. I don't have any faith in politics whatsoever. But yeah, that is as far as politics and the establishment. I see them as, I think the last time I was actually on Lev's show here was I was debating, what was the guy's name from the Atlantic Council?
Oh,
Lev?
my good friend Vladislav Davidson.
Yeah,
Yeah.
nice guy.
Very nice guy, yes.
But we were debating, he was basically coming from the viewpoint that there is no organized establishment. And when people talk about there's nothing really behind that, and they've never been able to, properly orchestrate anything. And then I brought up the Hunter Biden laptop, in which, obviously the intelligence agencies worked with the media, as well as social media companies, in order to hide a damaging story right before an election in order to influence it. And then, of course, there's research that shows that it would have changed a lot of people's votes and possibly, changed the outcome of the election. So on that basis, I think there's, my stance is very clear. I think that there is definitely an establishment that plans things out and tries to orchestrate pretty intense and wide array of different objectives, and they're able to complete complex operations. But in terms of the Roman Republic stuff, as far as my stance on it, I see a lot of similarities between like we were talking about before, the Roman Empire and kind of where the Roman Republic was before Caesar and during Caesar to America right now. Some of the interesting parallels that that really stick out to me is one, the fact that Donald Trump, of course, was voted out of office on January 7th, 2021, only because of the quote unquote insurrection. Otherwise, he would have been voted out on the 6th. It just so happens that Julius Caesar was voted out of power by the Roman government on January 7th. I believe it was, what was that, 49 BC, or it might have been 47, I forget. But it was exactly 2,070 years later. So, yeah, 49. And yeah, so that's just a funny coincidence. And the reason the Roman Senate voted Caesar out of power was so that he would lose his immunity to prosecution through the judicial system, which is, of course, exactly what they did to Donald Trump as soon as he was out of office. Now they've, opened up a bajillion cases, which they've, he's a convicted felon. And then, there's other coincidences, like the fact that the assassination attempt recently was on Julius Caesar's birthday, July 13th. And yeah, there's some deeper connections that we could go into. But I mean, I'm definitely not like, I wouldn't say I have, I'm not here to, give concrete evidence that he's, actually literally going to play the role of Julius Caesar. My content and my niche is making predictions based off of patterns, whether it be, and of course, whether it be astrology or propaganda, predictive programming. And I have had some pretty good success in the past. In October of 2019, I have a tweet that's fairly popular. That I said, imagine a world with 100% mandatory vaccination for school, travel, et cetera, et cetera. That's a system they want to implement, and it's coming soon. And of course, that was about a month before the November emergence of coronavirus. And then, of course, that the mandatory vaccination part didn't come for several years later. But yeah, that's kind of how I've reached this conclusion that Trump is going to play a similar role to Caesar, in which the Roman Republic, he wasn't technically the emperor, but he basically created the power vacuum and then filled it. And then when he was killed, it was filled by, the line of emperors that all called themselves Caesar. So yeah, I see a similar role where people talk about the New World Order. And I guess this might clear it up for some people. My viewpoint is that what people fear of a new world order, a one world government, which of course, everybody's always tried to do that, especially Caesar is a great example, trying to conquer as much of the world as possible. For them to finally do it, I think technology would make it a lot easier. But I think people think of it as, a WEF type, Klaus Schwab and Bill Gates.
You will eat the bugs. You will live in the pod.
I think people think of it, they think of a new world order. And if a one world government was to exist, it would be ruled by those guys. I think what's being set up is a more interesting drama, kind of like a WWE match, which of course is, Trump was in WWE. In which we have people who are comically clearly evil. Klaus Schwab, he talks like a comic book villain, bald, wears all the garb, and Bill Gates, the evil nerd, and all this stuff. I think if there's going to be a one world government or a new world order, it's going to be something. It's going to be a populist movement. It's going to everybody's going to be on board with it. It'll seem really cool for a lot of people.
The old switcheroo.
Yeah, and I think that's what to get everybody to join a one world government. You have to have a really cool leader. You have to have him conquer really despicable enemies, and I think that's kind of what's being set up now. And to prepare the population, there's been a lot of subliminal messaging that cuts across really the core of American culture and fiction, starting in World War II with the emergence of the Marvel superheroes as well as DC. They all kind of fill these similar archetypes, and I think really the best example of this is The Boys, the TV show The Boys, which is a more gritty. They take kind of the superhero world and merge it with the real world, and then of course the writers of the show directly admit that Homelander, the main character, which is kind of a fusion of Captain America and Superman, represents Trump. So in their season finale, which is, I believe it aired last night, I predicted basically as soon as Trump had the assassination attempt on him, I said, the season finale, nothing was leaked about it yet. I said 100% in the season finale of the show, they're going to have an assassination attempt on Homelander. And now that they did release the final episode, they literally had to put a disclaimer at the beginning, warning people, this isn't based on reality, whatever, because it's, Trump character is getting assassinated or attempted.
Well, that's not what I watched. It's not an assassination on the Trump character. It's an assassination on the president character because of the idea was
that he's working with.
No, the Trump character is working with the vice president. He's trying to install the VP as the president, so they're working together to assassinate the president.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
So it's a derivative of that, but yeah, I think that's the best example is The Boys really kind of takes the idea of all this superhero programming, preparing the population to accept not a democracy like we've had, quote unquote, that's debatable, but to accept a coming technocracy, which of course is ruled by the experts, as opposed to democracy, which of course Elon Musk's grandfather was arrested for being the head of the technocracy party in Canada during World War II, as the government thought he was a threat. Anyways, of course, Elon, Iron Man, and Captain America, Trump are now officially working together post-assassination. So that's kind of a broad, good idea of what my viewpoint is.
There's no way to really know whether or not these things are, planned in advance in some smoke-filled room, or that these are just certain synchronicities that occur because our whole reality is like one big play. So, you could look at it either way if you start seeing these patterns. What I want to focus on, though, as far as figuring out whether or not we're repeating or rhyming history over here, is, again, the nature of what exactly is this bureaucratic system that was, in a way, rejected by more of the populist types, because they rejected it both from, let's say, the Democrats and like the Bushite neoconservative Republicans, right? So I don't know if Uberboyo, if you have a good connection or not. There is that great thread that you made over here about your latest video, and I can read the thread talking about the exploit of elite class crushing the native middle class, which I think kind of brings us back to what exactly is this, end of the republic scenario that people are dissatisfied with that brought Trump into this whole thing. Unless you want to take this on and talk about it in more detail, depending on your connection right now.
My connection should be fine, but I think that is obviously the crux of the argument. Well, is there an argument? I'm not making an argument that Trump is Caesar, but it's just something I remember I pointed out. What if all history noticed it as well? And I remember after I started to write those threads, I came across a video that he was speaking about it. And it's almost like a systems analysis. Like people look at it as like a prophecy and, Jesus Christ returns and Donald Trump is Caesar. And I think that can make mistakes. It can blind you to actually something that I think is more interesting, which is almost like it's like economics and things like this. It's looking at the structure of society and how incentives can set up trends, and then a system can be pushed in a certain direction because of a set of incentives, and it sort of necessarily leads towards an imbalance of power and inequality that's going to lead to essentially a revolution. And so when you look at the ancient Republic of Rome, it was very successful. It was successful for hundreds of years, and the Romans were the most aristocratic race in all of human history, as Nietzsche said. And their sort of general attitude towards the way to conduct themselves was to go out and wage war and conquer the Untermensch around them, and then take slaves and bring the slaves in. And this is how you're supposed to conduct yourself as an elite. You're supposed to be it's war and leisure, as they used to say. And the Roman elite were doing this for a while, and eventually they got so good at it that they started to form essentially like a slave caste underneath them. And this became a very big problem because you had in Rome a native class. So you had the sort of native Romans, and then you had the upper elite Romans, who would have been, you could say, the exceptional Romans. And that would have been literally a nation, like an actual race united as a tribe. And the political leaders would go out and bring all these native Romans as legions. But then what began to happen over the centuries is that these incredible legions bring back slaves, and these slaves end up doing jobs for the very elite. And then the kind of middle bulk of native Romans start to actually have problems because of this. So, for example, these slaves would work on the farms. Now, this actually cheapens the labor pool. This is all going to sound like very Democrat stuff. It's quite fascinating the way it's all framed nowadays, because kind of everyone's a bit ignorant about this, I find. But the slaves are brought in. They cheapen the labor pool. And so the native Romans start to, not be able to make so much money, or their wages go down. And then on top of this, stuff like the accumulation of wealth starts to rise up into the political caste. And then a lot of different problems begin to happen as a consequence of this, because in order for you to work in the Senate, you didn't get paid money to be a Roman politician. You had to have wealth. So all the guys at the top started to gather more wealth and become the politically influenced. And they obviously began to construct the republic to suit them more and more and more. And then the native class begin to get, basically the kind of middle class begin to get squeezed out. There's no labor. They're competing with literal slaves who work for free because they'll get their balls cut off otherwise. And then they're competing against an elite who have these giant pools of slave labor and are starting to buy up all the land. Worse, again, in order for them to compete, they need money, obviously. So they start getting loans off this political elite. This political elite give them loans, but they use high interest rates, usury, as we know it formally. And this begins to rinse them. And the guy Brutus, who killed Caesar, or participated in the plot, he was charging interest at 400% in a Greek island of Crete. So, nowadays it'd be a big deal if interest rates go up from 5% to 6%. Back then it was 400%. It's insane. It's just pure exploitation. It had to get banned by the Catholic Church and the Muslims to do interest rates that much, because it's so weaponized when people use it this way. So all of these trends were in place in Rome, where essentially the elite, the top, the optimates, meaning optimal, the best, they were basically cooking the middle class elite. I guess you could say they were betraying the middle class, if you want, the native Romans. And Caesar represented this sort of countervailing force. Now, this is a very interesting countervailing elite force, because he's almost like a left-winger, if you think about it, or a Democrat. They call it a populist, whereas where we get the word populism from. And his family were like a faction of the elite that thought that if the elite exploit the middle class too much, because slaves they didn't give a fuck about. They're like, yeah, whatever, they're slaves. But if they exploit the middle class, the populace, the plebs too much, it causes inequality imbalance. Now, this is actually something that's been well studied now, and people have realized it's actually like massively socially destabilizing. So it's actually in the interest of the elites to be more, I guess you could say, left-wing or egalitarian, because it stabilizes the society. The more the elites create a hierarchy that favors them, the more it destabilizes things. So Caesar and all them, his family, were like supporting this. They were saying, look, we need to actually have the balance of power in place here. We need to make sure that we're doling out charity, or we're just making things more fair to them. A big kind of talking point was land reforms, literally taking land off the political elite and giving it back to the plebs.
I think Armand's going to be all about that, by the way, because Armand is a Yimby.
Let me just finish. I'm very close to finishing here. Just one second.
Yeah.
So this was a big thing. It's like one of the big major ones was ending usury, ending interest to balance things out. And the second one was giving back land. Basically, like it's almost like the student debt thing, that you hear Biden talk about. It was like that, but in a different sort of form that suited Rome. So give land to the plebs and end like massive loans, maybe even a debt jubilee. That was on the cards too. Now, what's fascinating is that there was a kind of run-up movement to do this. And the first kind of political force that came out of essentially the left back then, they were called the Gracchis. They were actually billionaires. Now, I say this is what Trump is like. They were a set of really wealthy merchant billionaires who kind of stood up, almost like businessmen, and said, listen, guys, because they probably would have been savvy businessmen. They say, listen, guys, this fucking system isn't going to work the way it's going. So I think we should do some reforms and balance the power levels here and give the natives something. Like land reforms was the big thing. And the political elite, these guys went, they did the political process. The political elite were like, these guys are going to win. So they killed them. They assassinated them. Now that's like, that was a big mask off moment, because then all of a sudden the populace said, holy shit, these fuckers aren't going to do what's right. They're not going to do what's fair. These guys, and the optimates, are very Nietzschean. They're like, why should we give the plebs anything? There are Untermensch, fuck them. And so what happened is Marius stands up. Marius is now much more aggressive. He's like a sort of military man, and he fights against the optimates. And the figure he fights against is Sulla, who's like one of the biggest badass mafia bosses you come across in all of history. And these two guys fight each other. And this is like, so if Trump is Gracchi, this is the sort of idea, is that what comes next now is going to be actual political war, political violence, political civil war. And this is just going to be like levels above what we're going through right now. And Caesar is the nephew of Marius. So it's kind of like, oh, there's a QR, one sec.
Everybody subscribe.
It's not a situation where Trump is Caesar, but it's more like Trump might be the sort of canary in the coal mine for this massive imbalance where the native class are feeling, the MAGA class feel like they're getting screwed. And this is only starting a process now that's going to lead to more and more polarization, eventually serious political violence, possibly civil war. And then out of that rises a military man who begins to promise everyone, saying, hey guys, I'll save you. And there's a lot we can go into here, again, from classical philosophy, the problem of the tyrant, because eventually a strong enough figure can show up and realizes he can gain consent off the masses by promising them debt jubilee and basically left-wing politics if you want, although it's not a fair way to frame it. But I'm basically saying to them, I'll save you from the elites. And then he gains like Caesar-level power. So that's kind of the prediction, if you will.
So thank you for that, Steph. Armand, do you see a connection between what Steph was talking about with these Roman Republic, optimates versus populares situations? Let me know what you think. Like, are you seeing some connection here?
Well, so I think there's sort of ways that it is parallel, ways that it's not. On the economics question, the reason that like slave labor increased income inequality for like wage labor is because slaves, unlike immigrants, which we're making sort of the modern analogy, they don't get to spend any money that they make, right? And so essentially they both undermine the wages of other people, but they're not increasing demand for things which would raise the wages of other people. It's all being funneled into the pockets of like the elites that own them. So essentially they're functioning almost like as capital rather than as labor. So in a modern day economy, like immigration neither increases nor decreases wages through like labor supply and demand effects, because like again, immigrants come, they make money, and then they also buy stuff, which increases demand for other wages. There are effects about productivity because they're complementary labor and on entrepreneurship, but slaves obviously function differently because they don't spend, basically they don't increase demand for labor because can't spend any of it. And so it does increase income inequality because all of that's funneled into the pockets like the people who own them. Um, that said, I do think that there are other economic conditions like long running income inequality in the United States, high inflation recently, um, that I think have caused like a lot of discontent. But I also do think there's something, I don't know, a little bit strange in that like even if, the economy is good now or not is like a contentious thing, and I know a lot of people disagree, but if you look at any of the metrics we have for the economy and then look at like previous periods of time, there have been many other times in U.S. history where things have been objectively a lot worse and people were a lot less mad about it. Um, and so there's something about this unique moment where, and I think it's something that's we were trying to figure out. Maybe it is because like inflation is something that's particularly uh, infuriating, or maybe it's just like the images or the sense of like a chaotic border is making people feel under assault. Maybe it's the unique media environment. We do have like we have a perfectly optimized sort of digital media ecosystem that because people respond to like negativity and negativity goes viral, really constantly funnels like information that's like things are really, really horrible. A lot of different ways to look at it. Bottom line, though, is I think the sentiments are very similar in that people do feel, across the board politically, very cynical, very jaded. Things aren't working. People are really, really unhappy. And that creates an opening for, people to offer a chance to shake it up, right? Like that's sort of like what led in 2016, why there was like within the Democratic Party, there are a lot of people who voted for Bernie who weren't necessarily super left wing, but there's just a sense that like Hillary Clinton represented the system and the establishment, and wanted to throw it overboard. And they weren't. So if you actually look at like I think that was part of Bernie's mistake politically speaking in 2020, is he read it all as like a commitment to really left wing policy. But if you look at the people who voted for him, a lot of people who voted for him were like much more conservative than the median like Hillary Clinton voter. It was just like a lot of people would just like wanted an outsider to change things. And I think now, especially for like increased political violence, like an assassination of a former president is a huge deal. And in particular, actually, what's interesting is that the more it comes out about this guy who did it, the more it seems like he didn't even have a very clear ideology or goal. He was just he was like Googling which president was going to come near him next, which I think speaks to there's similar to what was happening in Rome, is there is a large growing dissatisfaction of the establishment or the system and the way things are going, and people are like hungry for something that offers them a big change, and are really, but don't know what it is, can't agree on it, and are really increasingly like very frustrated.
Now, Armand, by the way, please make sure to mute when you're not speaking, just so there's not the sounds of the keyboard and all that. But I want to hand this over to, before Drew, Uberboyo. I want to make sure that we're on the same page about this difference between the immigrants, the illegal immigrants versus who are working versus the slaves. So to Armand's comment about them bringing things back into the economy, there was also a comment that I saw recently up here talking about how the migrants also overwhelmingly bring their money, to their home country. Now, I haven't looked at the statistics. I don't know if that's the case, but would you say that there is a pretty big difference between those two, or do you see a similarity when it comes to the very easy way to migrate into the United States over the period of the past decades, creating this troublesome situation with the Americans who were originally here?
So I'm not an economist, so I can't say for certain how any of this stuff works. Like I wouldn't understand it, but I can just tell you the historical analogies, and I think it's like almost like first principles. You should probably start from the idea that when slave labor comes in, it does tend to actually be a relationship between an elite and an underclass. Like, this is something you see almost consistently throughout history. Haiti is a brilliant example. The French take in loads of slaves, and Jesus, did they take in a lot of slaves. And that just essentially led to a necessarily unstable civilization that toppled Haiti. The Dominican Republic, literally on the same island, took in like a significantly less amount of slaves because the Spanish had a taboo against slavery from the very beginning of colonialism. And that's one of the wealthiest Latin American countries in like all of the world. And it's fascinating to see the legacy of these types of things. Obviously, the Black Americans in the USA are the same example. So we look at what's going on at the moment, and like, would you say these immigrants coming in are slaves? You know, it's clearly an attempt for the elite to bring in people who are cheap labor, 100%. Now, maybe there's a way that they figured out modern economics to make that work and not cause problems, and I don't understand it. That could definitely be true. But I would just look at the sort of unconscious rumblings that you're seeing, which is that temperature is obviously going up, you know, and we can say, oh no, it's don't worry, the system's working fine. But it's like, look, I don't know. I'm looking back at history. The temperature's rising up. People are feeling screwed. It could be social media radicalizing them. I'm actually quite open to that it's maybe not as bad as people say, and people are just getting radicalized for some reason. But generally speaking, I think it's wise, shall I say, to ground ourselves and say, well, listen, you know, this is how these trends tend to unfold. In Caesar's time, this exact same first principle pattern was happening. Cheap foreign slaves coming in. The slaves, by the way, weren't just like reduced to chattel slavery. They were actually able to make their own money. They were able to eventually become free, often within a lifetime. Happened to quite a lot of them. And that still had the effect of flooding the market, the Rome with native slaves. So this is actually another big problem, is that the free men often would do better sometimes than the natives, because the political elite would give them, you know, they would like leave them land sometimes, or give them more money. They give them like an inheritance because that was their personal slave.
And eventually they'd become citizens too. Like, there was this expansion of the Roman Empire. Now we're talking, you know, imperial times, when those who were living in the new provinces ended up becoming Roman citizens. And I don't know, like, would you say something like that also contributed to the eventual decline of the Roman Empire? Just because, like, if it's like that quote from The Incredibles, like, if everybody's super, nobody's super.
Yeah, this gets a little bit ruthless, so I don't want to be too rude or anything like this. But I think what happened when Caesar came is he tried to reform the Roman Republic and try to make it, weirdly, he tried to do something that made it a little bit more egalitarian, and actually tried to take power off the elite and make it a sort of a more equal society, almost like liberalized it in a weird way. And then that itself started to set up another problem, which was the Rome started to become an awful lot more open, because all empires have to be like this, you know. The USA was clearly founded on the principles of, like, you know, the founding stock was Anglo white people, and they could barely take in Irish people, you know. But then after it became hegemon, it had to shift to the concept of, like, we take in everybody. That's the necessary principle that has to happen for an empire. And so once Rome started to go that direction, all sorts of same incentives. This stuff is very complicated. Incentives push them this way. Caracalla needs a bigger army to fight big wars, and so he liberalizes citizenship, you know. And then this eventually comes to a point where, towards the end of the Roman Empire, 50% of most cities were essentially slaves, and that's not even the count of people who were ancestors of slaves, like active 50%, which is just enormous at that point. And I often put forward the idea that Christianity came out of this. You have a lot of people from the Middle East come into Rome, and that's in the genetics. And Christianity was actually almost like a very, very maybe rude, but communist revolution against the sort of old Roman establishment that was basically not even there at that point, you know? And so I like a lot of these trends are very fascinating things. When they take out over the course of centuries, they become even more crazy. So, it's an interesting way to think.
Now, before going back to Armand, Drew, do you agree with what Uberboyo was talking about here? And do you see this parallel? Because he was talking about how even though the migrants aren't slaves, obviously, the slaves back during the Roman Republic days were also able to, in a way, contribute to the economy. I don't know, like, by how much, but do you see a similar parallel going on here? And then we're going to go back to Armand.
Oh, yeah, 100%. That's, there's a lot of new information for me there, but it's it's right in line with my viewpoint on it. I think the kind of uncapped immigration that we have going on right now is definitely going to play a big part in in kind of this transition, in my view, that obviously there needs to be a bit of chaos in order to bring in a new order. So with Caesar, it looked like after he was voted out on Jan 7th, then he crossed the Rubicon, bringing in his army to Rome, and that, of course, was illegal. You couldn't cross the Rubicon with your army, and it started the Roman Civil War. So there was an era of chaos. He ends up victorious, and then he establishes dominance, dictator for life, and of course the power vacuum created by his assassination, ends up getting filled by Octavian, and then the line of Caesars afterwards. What I see, as the stand-in for the Civil War, and I know Tim Pool and others have been talking about the concept of a civil war with the rising tensions in the country.
And by the way, Drew was on Tim Pool's show, Armand, just so you know. So that's where I got the nice avatar picture of him there for the. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, no, it was fun. But
Was he wearing the hat?
Oh, of course, he never takes that off. Is
he bald under there? Like,
oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
He wore it at like a pool party. It's a little silly.
A Tim Pool party, if you will.
Well, I think he wore it at Mar-a-Lago. I think even when he had a suit on, he had the beanie on. He's a funny character. He's really cool. And when we were over there, he's like showing me all of his toys. He's got like a indoor skate park, and he was playing his new music for me. So really, he's a funny guy.
Yeah, Armand, you should go. You should be like a good opposition to what is talked about there. I'm telling you.
I mean, if you'll have me on, I'll go.
Yeah, I don't know, Drew, if you could pull some strings, since you've already been on the show. Who knows? Anyway, back to the topic at hand, though. I want to bring it back to Armand. So, Armand, you've heard Drew and you've heard Uberboyo talking about this connection. Even though there is this difference between, slaves and the migrants, the idea here is that a lot of these privileges have been eventually bestowed upon way, way, way more people, and whether something like that is something that a country can handle in the long term. Well, that would be the point number two, once it's become an empire. Point number one would...
sorry to interrupt. My battery's probably going to go in about 5 minutes, so I'll if I drop out, that's just what happens. So
gotcha.
Well, let Armand go ahead.
Okay. So, well, that would be point number two, and point number one would be when it comes to the migrants coming in here as they have been coming in here the past decades, do you also see there being like this kind of deal between the Democratic Party over these past, and the Republican Party as well, as far as like the old school Republicans, and the migrants as far as cheap labor, making the line go up, that kind of stuff, and whether what we're seeing right now with the, talk of deportations and all of that is kind of like the inevitable answer to this situation, and if it's not the answer, then what would be the answer? Like, how do we steer this ship in the right way so that we don't go the direction of the Roman Empire?
I was just going to say, if Uberboyo's battery's dying, maybe we could give him a chance to see his last piece.
Yeah, unless, Steph, you're going to go somewhere where you're going to have a charger and you'll be able to plug that in.
I won't. I'll be gone.
You'll be gone.
There's not really much for me to say. Maybe it's better Armand kind of says what he thinks, and if my battery runs out, so be it.
Well, that's true. Before you go though, please plug whatever you want to plug right now, what the great Uberboyo is working on right now, and where people can find you.
You're all good. I have a video on all this stuff, so it's explained obviously more at length. So if anybody does think I'm making any sense at all, that might be an interesting video to check out. Other than that, follow Lev, I guess. Break the rules and I'll subscribe.
Thank you very much, Steph. All right, Armand, you got the floor, buddy.
So, two things. One, on the economics, and I don't want to, we've had these debates here before, so we don't need to dwell on it. I'll just reiterate that the overwhelming body of economic research shows that immigration does not lower native wages, because in the same reason that having babies and having a higher population does not mechanically lower wages, because new people who make money also spend money. It is true, somebody mentioned some of it goes through remittances, but overwhelmingly they spend because they've got to eat, they got to have a house to live in, new workers. Countries do not become poorer by having more people and growing. They become more affluent. That said, I do think that there are parallels from a cultural perspective. I do think like one of the things I've really I think come to understand is like a lot of resentment against immigration, frustration of immigration. There's not a lot of strong correlations between economic trends. Like there are periods of time where wages are going up and immigration is like a certain pattern. Like there's no consistent trend. I think it's more of a like you were talking about the privileges and like there's a higher percentage of the population is migrants and they're becoming um, citizens. And I'm not an expert in Roman history, but I do know, for example, like I think the biggest strike against like immigration in the United States in the last few years has just been like the consistent images of like lots of people at the border, images of migrant shelters like in New York being overwhelmed, um, and all that really is downstream of the fact that we have a really broken asylum process that's like not designed for a modern global economy where people can, it's designed for like a boat of refugees
Mm,
comes during a war and we have international treaties around that and we should let them
yeah.
in. Now anybody can fly in, and if they're willing to take the risks, and it is a very difficult, tough journey, but if they make it, they have to be processed. And when because we don't have the asylum officers and so on, it creates a massive backlog. It creates like a really perverse situation where like I personally think we should have lots of immigration. I think immigration is great, but I also think we need to set up a process where people can be like go through an orderly and organized fashion.
Mm.
And I think people are really resentful of the fact that it's not, and it feels chaotic and overwhelming.
Well,
And I
just
can
real
imagine
quick,
that,
just real quick.
yeah,
J.J. Carell, who I had on, he was a former Border Patrol agent. He was talking about how the Department of Homeland Security refugee app has been utilized by the drug cartels through this auctioning system where people all around the world now can vote. I'm not vote, can pay money to get a VPN in northern Mexico, and then they are flown over to northern Mexico and are able to freely cross as refugees, no problem, without any kind of proof having to be provided. So, like with my family, for example, we were refugees. Like we came from the Soviet Union and we had reasons why we were fleeing back then, and it was still like a super rigorous process, like the amount of things that my family had to prove and document and show and all that. So already it just feels like, and I'm curious, like Drew, what you think as well about this, it just feels like looking at this from the side that there has been a lot of there has been a lot of ease in this process, which feels almost intentional as far as how Mayorkas, wanted Texas to stand down from erecting barriers and all of that. So it almost feels like they wanted to bring in more migrants. Now, would you say, well, that's just because of, they wanted a good economy? Or is there something else, some other reason why that's been going on? So I don't know. I
can I
know.
just
Sure. And I know,
quickly
by the
on
way,
that?
we're going more into the migration, so I'm going to go back into the
Yeah.
Caesarism eventually, but I just wanted to make sure that we cover this. Yeah, Armand, let me know what you think.
So the thing is that there is still like, if you actually go through like the silent process and the hearing, so on, it is a very difficult process, and there are many cases that I'm personally familiar with where even though they were like really sad and really tragic, like it was still like, well, you don't meet the exact criteria of you need to have like, for example, there was a Venezuelan small business owner who was threatened by like local gangs, and they burned down his business, tried to come after his family, and he eventually was rejected for asylum because he could not definitively prove that it was due to political activism, and that it was from the government. And so but what happened is so many people have come, and we have very few like asylum, not enough asylum judges or asylum officers, and so it creates a self-fulfilling like loop where it's like, well, even if you don't have a great asylum claim, because the system's so backlogged, you know that you can come to the U.S. and worst case scenario, you work here and make some money for 5 years, and either like and they don't catch you, or you get another legal status, or you just go home. Um, and so like I don't actually think, you know, you might think it's intentional. I understand, but I think part of what people really have to understand is that it's the sheer lack of resources in the system has created a self-fulfilling problem of like there is a very long process, and it's become longer because it's like more people coming in, and it's like it's self-destructive in that way.
Mm.
The asylum hearing that you're talking about there, does that take place as soon as they come across the border, or is that what happens? From last time I heard, they're giving them a court date in the future to come in for a hearing. Is that what that is, or is that something that happens
That's the
immediately when they cross?
those are the court dates, and so initially you have what's called a credible fear screening, which like they ask you like a certain set of questions to see if like you at all like pass sort of a basic bar. But then like you have multiple court hearings and so on. But people are getting court hearings of like 3 years ahead. And so like, if and I don't blame these people, if I'm a really poor person living in like El Salvador, and I know that like my worst case scenario is like, well, I can work in the United States for 3 years and then my claim's rejected and I go home. That's still like a good deal. But then enough people say that and it keeps pushing the dates back
But
and
they're
back
not
and
allowed
back.
to work.
You
Aren't
get a
they not
work
allowed to
permit
work
after
while they're waiting?
it takes a period of time, about 6 months to a year, but then you can get like a work permit. Um,
Mm.
Lev,
um,
before I go, if I can maybe cut in with this, and this probably is
Absolutely.
going to
Go
final
ahead.
statement. I might get cut off halfway through, but
That's okay.
just on that note then of economics again, because it is a very interesting one, and I think I'm very pessimistic, and the ideas I present here are extremely pessimistic, and I understand that, and I think Armand and I would say people generally on what I would call the left tend to be much more optimistic, which is fine. I don't want to go around being a party pooper, But I think there's a problem sometimes which comes from a psychological problem, a mistake in how to think. What if Alt-Hist, actually, I know he might be, maybe people don't like him, but he has a very good video on this. And it's the problem of, measurement statistics can tell you anything if you want to lie to yourself. And so, for example, a very common version of this would be simply inflation. You could say, like, I'm making, $400,000 a year. But if you understand consequently that in the 1920s, that $400,000 would have been 97% more powerful, like a huge magnitude more powerful because of things like inflation, you start to realize that money is not the same. Like money all those years ago is not the same as it is now. So the number is quite strange. Another example of this, for example, would be people looking at all these stats and all this data saying that like everything's going fine. And it's like, look, I'm not sure if we're crunching or bending or switching numbers or trying to lie to ourselves. And a lot of people are saying at the moment that basically the entire civilization we're in runs off fiat, runs off this sort of attempt to say everything is all right, but underneath the surface, the actual reality, the actual truth is not there. So it's like a haze, a matrix of numbers that we're lying to ourselves with. And this is the problem that you even, again, see in the Roman Empire. Like it was the same issue where back then during the Republic, they figured out, for the first time in history, but it was a pretty early example of widespread use of leveraged money. And they started to see things like, oh, I can just go in and mint a load of coins. And all of a sudden I have more money. And these guys, I think Rome is so fascinating because it forces you to think in terms of processes. You'll have somebody like the generation before Caesar print a load of money, and the result.
Oh, there we go. That was the final breath of the great Uberboyo, and he shall return at a future stream, but right now that is all that his poor cell phone could take. But Armand, from what you were able to hear about the fiat currency and all of that, any thoughts on that before we go back into the Caesarism and all that?
I, I mean, it's a little hard to disentangle sort of the things he was saying, but I'll just say that like since we left the gold standard, like the U.S. economy's had a lot less boom and bust cycles. Like trying to tie yourself to hard currencies difficult because what happens is that you one, it's deflationary, and that can cause spirals of like recessions, people lose their jobs. But two, it's like setting your money supply based off of like the amount of physical gold in the world. It's not optimal. I will say also I do need to run in about like 2 minutes. So.
All right. So before you run, I wanted to ask Drew. Drew, what exactly would you say is the likelihood of deportations, things that I know Armand is not a big fan of, happening with the Trump administration? And do you see certain things like that as being, even though you could say that they're morally questionable things, do you see things of that nature happening that unfortunately will have to occur in order to, steer this ship in the right way?
Well, yeah, whether or not it's the right way, I guess we'll find out. But in terms of what I see happening here with the immigration crisis is this is kind of what I was talking about right before in my last little segment here. The Civil War aspect. I don't see it being like that movie, that Civil War movie that came out this year, that conveniently. Um, I don't see it playing out like that or anything like the Civil War, the original, the classic. Um, I think it's going to be more of maybe it will be state versus state on some level, but I think it's going to be more of like just a decentralized, chaotic situation, much like during the rioting during the pandemic. Um, we had imagine we have that level of chaos again, and then add in what's the estimate now? 6 million new immigrants since 2021. It's New York, both the New York mayor, New York City mayor Adams, and I believe it's Brian Johnson in Chicago. Both of them say that this immigration crisis is going to have catastrophic effects on both the cities because they can't handle it. Imagine a chaotic situation, and add in all those extra people who are already desperate. Um, so what I see happening though is, say Trump does get back into office and that goes smoothly. I'm sure there's going to be rioting if that happens. If history is any guide, in 2016 it definitely wasn't too peaceful when he got in the first time. I would say though, if the idea of mass deportations, I think there was recently a poll, which of course, how much can you trust polls? But it was a pretty shock finding that I forget what percentage of Americans are okay with mass deportations, but I believe it was a shocking number. It was way more than you think it would be, and that was covered in the news pretty heavily. But I think in that situation, obviously these cities, if you watch Chicago, city hall meetings, you'll see the local residents saying, you can't shut down our recreation centers to turn them into shelters. Like, this is our money. We're already, struggling before, and now you're giving all of our resources to people who aren't, even born here, and you're just, bringing them in and giving them our stuff. So there is wide range of people. It's not necessarily just this kind of stereotype you have of people who are against immigration, a racist white guy or whatever. There's definitely minority and disadvantaged groups that are not too happy with this either. And if Trump did come in, he's got a lot of momentum behind him right now, especially given Biden's obvious. That was really hilarious too, is how long they pretended like he was conscious and could operate, and then as soon as they couldn't hide it anymore, it was of course everybody acted like they always knew. But yeah, he's got a lot of momentum. I think he has the political capital to do a mass deportation if he comes in, and I think that could be, what triggers kind of the equivalent of Caesar's civil war, where there's no doubt going to be wild protests for that. Obviously, we've seen like I was saying before, the pandemic protests.
Yeah.
Now
I want to make sure. I want to make sure, Armand, since you did say 2 minutes you have to go, I want to make sure that you respond to what you was talking about. And in general, what do you view as the worst case scenario happening here with a possible Trump Imperium and, being passed down to Baron, or you never know what's going to happen when it comes to those kind of things. But what is it that you fear the most with this whole populism, MAGA, Trumpism thing, personally speaking? Like, what is it you want to avoid? And then please plug your stuff, because I want to make sure we get that too.
So really quickly, just to touch on two things that Drew was talking about, the cities. The biggest issue for cities is, one, it does take still quite a while for folks to get work permits. And so what you find consistently is like most of the people like in the migrant shelters who are taking up city resources, it's in the period of time before the feds can issue them a work permit. After they get work permits, they tend to move to lower cost areas and like get jobs and so on. And so the period of time people stay, if you look at like the numbers, is that really is sort of the main thing. Is like people come, but they're not able to work, and so they have to be in a shelter. But then the second thing on that is that the it's also like liberal cities in general are terrible at building housing. They really restrict building housing. So of course it's in New York, for example, it's like they banned essentially a couple of years ago banned de facto banned new construction of hotels and then banned Airbnb, and then they are putting migrants in hotels, and so it's like driving up those prices. It's like so much of it is the fault of progressives for being more addicted to like NIMBYism than building. On the bigger picture, I think the most likely scenario is not like something quite as dramatic as a Caesar, but more of like a Hungary situation where what you saw in Hungary is like it was more democratic, but it sort of has chipped away at democracy in slow and subtle ways. And so, for example, like there's more control over the press from the government. There's more arresting of political opponents. There's more manipulation of elections, and I think something similar will happen where it's like Trump has um, very like very clearly signaled that he wants to use legal authority against like political opponents, and that he wants to use like the IRS and the FBI. The whole thing about Schedule F, where he's going to put in a ton of his loyalists. The fact that the Supreme Court has vastly expanded his powers. Like, I think there probably will be an election in 2028, but I think that election will happen under very like more in the same way that they happen in Turkey and they happen in Hungary, but I think they'll be under significantly less democratic circumstances. And finally, for plugging, just follow me on Twitter at Armand Doma. As always, a great time. Really lovely to meet you, Drew. Thank you, Lev. I really have to run.
All right, Drew. Next time you're gonna wear the American flag suspenders with sticks. So that's gonna be that's gonna be an interesting one. The Trump debate. All right, take care, brother. So, Drew, how much time do you have right now to talk? We may have a few people coming in as well, but let me know how everything's going on your side right now.
Yeah, I could go for probably another 20 minutes or so. Yeah, the wife is kind of harassing me, but I think she'll be okay for another 20 minutes.
All right, sounds good. So I wanted to get to Trump and the loyalism that's going on around here, because you have J.D. Vance, who became his vice presidential running mate right now, who is somebody who did compare him to Hitler early on. And now it seems like what's happening is that he's almost making up for it so much by being as loyal of a person as he possibly could be. Do you see there being a potential for tyranny down the line, even if it's, unintentional from Trump himself, when you get somebody like Trump who gets surrounded by a bunch of ass-kissers? And as much as we may not like certain things about the Republican establishment, the neocons, whatever, when it does come to certain things, like I was talking about Ukraine, for instance, and the danger of Russia, which I pretty much believe works for China and is just like China's attack dog, going in and taking one territory after another, thus expanding China's reach that people like J.D. Vance claim to be against, but end up actually empowering through, not stopping Russia while it goes further and further, out from its den. So when it comes to those blind spots that I think a lot of those people have, when they want to profess all this loyalty to somebody like Trump, does this eventually create somebody who, may have had good intentions, but starts getting, deteriorated after a certain point because there's no contrary voice in the room to say, like, hey, I don't think this is a good idea?
Well, I don't think Trump's main issue has never been having too many yes men around him. That is traditionally the exact opposite. He's had Bolton, he's had he's hired the swamp. Essentially, that's the biggest problem with his old administration. Of course, Jared Kushner, even, which I believe Kushner said he wasn't going to be involved this time. Thank God.
Wait, why thank God? The Abraham Accords, those are pretty nice, things calmed down there for a bit, like in the Middle East. So, like, I don't know. I don't really see anything that bad about, like, Kushner necessarily. Again, you could show me something that says otherwise. But with people like Bolton and such, there is this question of, the neocon policy when it comes to, places like Iraq, which was an obvious disaster, which does make me think like somebody like Bolton should have no business being anywhere just because of his, ruined reputation there. But at the same time, like, if he just gets surrounded by yes men now, because, yeah, you're right, he was surrounded by no men before, but if he gets
Oh yeah,
surrounded
they
by yes
literally
men
lied
now,
to him. The military said they lied to him, and pushed back the Afghanistan withdrawal as much as possible. Even though, of course, he wanted to do it the whole time, they push it back as far as possible. And then when they do leave, they just leave the Taliban a shit ton of weapons. So I think I guess the yes men thing. I don't really see that as an issue. I think it's traditionally he's had the exact opposite problem. But I mean, yeah, there's going to be some level of dick riding that happens in an administration, and of course, if Trump, hopefully he's figured out not to hire people who hate him, or hopefully he does find some people who are loyal so he can get shit done this time. And it was pretty funny saying, I hope he doesn't appoint any loyalists with the FBI and everything, and oh yeah, the next election they might weaponize lawfare and have the intelligence agencies put their finger on the election, which is just so. I mean, that is a problem. Don't get me wrong, but it's a problem in the opposite direction. They spent his entire presidency attacking him, the FBI and the entire news media, pretending he was a Russian agent the entire time, which is hilarious. Which they still claim is true. Like if you talk to a real hardcore Mueller buddy that has the Mueller Saint candles, they'll still say he was a Russian agent, but the media doesn't dare do that anymore. Even with it, which is surprising, even with the conflict in Ukraine, it just goes to show how absolutely what an absolute scam and an intelligence agency operation that was. But yeah,
I disagree. I disagree. There, as you know, I am very pro.
Wait, you're Russiagate? You think Russiagate?
No,
was a
no,
real
no,
thing?
no, no, not Russiagate. I am very no,
okay,
no,
yeah.
no. Come on, what are you kidding me? No, I am very pro helping Ukraine right now, just because I see just because I see Russia and China as being one and the same. And the last thing that we want is, even though we don't like a lot of these, military-industrial complex things that have occurred throughout America's history, I think it's very important to keep in mind gaps of power and what happens when, let's say, a U.S. military base decides to, abandon ship in a certain part of the world. Then all of a sudden you have China creeping in there, Russia creeping in there, and that creates a lot more pressure on us because these are also the same people, like take Russia, for example, that have been funding the migrants to cross over into the United States, as well as in Europe. They have been weaponizing the Muslim migrants to go into various parts of Europe. There were Russian sailors that got arrested after crossing from Greece to Italy, smuggling the migrants in. The Mexican Russian embassy has way more people in there than the Brazilian one, even though Brazil is part of BRICS. So all the things that I've seen so far, especially when it comes to Russian TV and the things that Putin and Lavrov and Medvedev, who is the vice president, talk about, their whole idea is we are going to get back the territory not just of the former Soviet Union, but the Russian Empire as a whole. And as you know, like with the history of the Roman Empire, once you start gobbling up one piece of territory, you're always going to find a justification to keep going and going. And if you're getting funded by China, it's going to be in China's interest for Russia to take over more territory because that way it's their territory as well. Because like I said before, they own Russia. Russia's a glorified gas station for them as well as for the Russian oligarchs. So they're going to be taking a lot of advantage of that, which is to say, like, you're all about a lot of the mystical things that we talk about here. And I think that the Hegelian dialectic also plays a role there, where you have people who are completely opposed to the one thing that if they were to actually support, a lot of problems could be fixed. And it seems like on both sides there is a thing like that going on. So I see a lot of people who are against Biden and against the current year millennial Zoomer administration, with all of the transgenderism and all this stuff going on. And they are against Zelensky, they're against Ukraine because the regime is for Ukraine, not because they've actually thought it through as far as what it would mean if Russia were to acquire all this territory. So that's what I mean. Like, I really want to try to break apart this dialectic because it's going to bite us in the ass.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I really, I admittedly have not looked into it too much and beyond, from my perspective, it's from what I've seen. I believe they had, who is the UK version of Trump, that fucking dorky looking dude?
You're talking about Nigel Farage, right?
No,
No?
no, no. The blonde one.
Oh, Boris
Yeah, Boris.
Johnson.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's from what I see, there's the military-industrial complex is, of course, Russia's a threat, but from my perspective, it looks like the military-industrial complex is literally just using Ukrainians as, a profit. It's obvious in my perspective. I don't think they're going to win. I don't think it's possible, and I don't think they've really done much to hurt Russia. This whole thing. And really, all that's happened is we continue to give money to our own military-industrial complex, but we give it to the most corrupt nation on earth, and then they have no accountability for it. Money goes missing. There was the one news piece where they came out and said, "Hey, yeah, a lot of the money isn't going to the front lines. It's just disappearing." They immediately they put a teaser up on Twitter, and I believe it might have been NBC. And they took it down before they even aired it because the regime said, no, you can't do that. But anyways, that's pretty outside of the topic of the Roman Empire. I guess to get back just a loop and finish off my ideas on, how the immigration crisis ties into the whole Caesar thing is that, Trump comes in, mass deportations, the protesting that goes around that is going to be insane. And of course, these, a lot of these migrants from Venezuela, they're gang associated, especially in New York. They've caught quite a few gang associated Venezuelans who are running retail theft rings. They're, basically establishing their gangs.
And they're also associated with Hezbollah as well. Hezbollah's got gold mines in Venezuela supported by, who?
Is it Putin?
It is Putin, exactly. So That's what I'm talking about. It all goes back to this whole Axis thing. But no, I understand what you mean. As far as these things, I have to look at this report, and I am going to go to King Salmonfish, who is joining us right now, to go back into the Caesarism. One final thing that I just want to say about that whole thing with Ukraine is we're giving F-16s that we're not using anyway, and that would be a lot more expensive to throw out. So that is just something that they're getting, without having to, waste our money. And the second thing that I would say is that even if you're right about all the stuff, it does not change the fact that these powers like Russia and China are still going to keep on expanding, and it is only because we want to remain in a particular circle and close off the idea that this is a problem that I think this is going to be a problem. So the only thing that I would encourage, I don't want to dwell on this too much right now because you're right, this isn't what this show is about, this episode at least. I would just encourage to try to, just try to imagine the argument of the other side here as far as these potential consequences and how exactly these can be prevented. That's all I ask. So on to Salmonfish over here, King Salmonfish with the shades and the necklace over here and the proudly wearing the cross there. So I always like having you on because you are an interesting fella. What do you think about this potential for Caesarism? Do you agree with Drutang's view on this whole game being played on top of us here? You got to unmute yourself, buddy. And by the way, everybody subscribe.
Yeah, sorry, my phone's about to die, so it went dark the second you said that, of course. So I got 2 seconds to rant here. I just got off work, so I'm just kind of on the side of a barn, actually. So anyway, this is a complicated issue because certain things have changed economically that I think rearranged the equation a little bit. So Larry Fink was out there the other day talking about how most financing doesn't come from the banks anymore, but more from the money market. And so this seemingly doesn't matter to a lot of people, but it does matter because So Biden is out. Everyone knows he's not really an option. That's going to pretty much default to Kamala. So it's one of these weird situations where everyone can kind of agree on a couple things, forced sort of by circumstance, which is kind of nice. I think that's a relief from the constant conflict and whatever. But basically, we're stuck with Trump and pretty much Kamala because everything else is completely insane and non-viable. And then basically what's going to happen is realistically, Trump's going to get in just because he's got like all the tech billionaires and everything behind him now because of the economic circumstances that are not remotely stable in the near-term future, because the Fed is pretty much underwater in terms of like liquidity and everything. This is going to affect geoeconomics significantly. It's beyond even BRICS. So BRICS is pretty much just changing the reserve currency, but the reserve itself has been affected. So this doesn't have much effect whatsoever as far as like the currency itself, which means basically like, yes, the United States is taking a hit, but so is literally everyone else, because effectively there's really just like everything pegged to the dollar. There's essentially one currency or something like that. So anyway, all these other countries are actually going under at approximately the same time. So that changes the military strategic situation because they're greatly disadvantaged in exactly the same way simultaneously. So China's economy is really, really tight right now. I was hearing some noise. Maybe Xi's going to step down. I don't know about that one. But I can understand if everything was really, really tight, that you're seeing a lot of people bail. The CEO of Vanguard was ousted. A lot of people are retiring from Congress. A lot of stuff is happening simultaneously, which is completely unusual and not the normal pattern, which would be indicative of, well, anyway, I think the Great Reset can't happen, mathematically speaking, because, God, it's hard to explain this one. It's a really long-winded whole thing, but basically it required a very, very tightly tuned together managerial schedule of AI development, tech development. Like most of the stock market is in these tech stocks. So there was like a managerial schedule that was supposed to coincide with the kind of late stage inflationary funnel, the math on kind of the debt spiral. So that's not in alignment anymore mathematically. There was a bit of an acceleration because of costs outstripping productivity that didn't occur, meaning money that was never created and can't possibly be gotten back or leveraged in any type of way. So long story short, a lot of things are going to happen. There's tons and tons and tons of layoffs, major companies filing bankruptcy all over the place. You're seeing it in like, mainstream outlets. You're seeing, like.
But I just want to focus.
CNN.
I just want to focus more as far as Trump being a potential, dictator, Caesar, or anything like that.
Yes.
Like,
my conclusion is that Trump is probably going to get in because without troops and everything, there's insufficient troops for martial law. The economic collapse can't really be managed. So all we're left with, strangely enough, is historically, political instability leads to chaos and violence. So we're just stuck with like political stability as a situation, which is the only consideration, because the robots and the immigrants and everything are not going to. Now the immigrants are actually a net negative to the economic situation because like welfare is drying up, and so is
but do you think that he's going to be?
Loans.
I want to make sure we're on track here, though. I'm not asking like, do you think he's going to win? I'm asking like, if he does win, do you think he's going to take more of an authoritarian stance on issues?
Yeah, 100%, because like the super duper competent independent types are kind of immensely averse to a lot of what's happening right now. So you're going to end up with like a Chud army. If you want the kind of corny, realistic timeline that we're looking at here, we're looking at like a military industrial complex, like Silicon Valley alliance of fucking rich people that are going to have an army of chuds that have technically kind of immature psychology. So that'd be like, level 1 is you don't understand what words mean. Level 2 is that you confuse words for the meaning. Level 3 is that you actually understand that words refer to meaning. So people are lost in images. We are in a 5th generation psychological warfare type situation. So effectively, you're going to have a bunch of people that are psychologically regressed, or they were fixated in that they never actually matured to be able to understand objective reality type thing. which also leads to a bunch of like psychosexual and actually ideological expressions that are more a result of like instinctual hardwiring that's a certain type of way, because if the environment is insufficiently hospitable for the organism, it tends to go into crisis, which then leads to basically certain behaviors like crisis behaviors. Like your frontal brain starts shutting down and it's more emotional and more impulsive reactive behavior, so that's where you get the chuds basically.
Now, I wanna bring it to Drew. And Drew, I know you don't have that much time right now. The wife may be calling soon, but I want to get your take on this Chud army, because as we know, Hitler, he had his army of former World War I veterans. There was a lot more, let's say, military expertise when it came to these things. Now, most of the people who would probably make up this Chud army, their only experience would be on Discord and buying up gamer girl bathwater. So, do you actually anticipate there being something to fear from this kind of Chud army, as far as them being like the tip of the spear of some kind of an authoritarian movement down the line?
Oh, in terms of like, so it's a Trump Chud army, right? That's what we're talking about?
We could start with Trump, although my personal feeling is that it wouldn't really come into its own around the time of Trump, but if things start getting worse, then eventually there would be like these people who kind of grew up on 4chan poll, and they would be the ones that, if things get really bad, would start to unite and like form some kind of, front groups and, inner groups inside those front groups. And, they would start to, like Hannah Arendt wrote in The Origins of Totalitarianism, they would start to make duplicates of existing organizations. So like fishing clubs and bowling clubs and hunting clubs, like they would start to make these clones, and they start to influence things in society through eventually becoming stronger than the things that they cloned, and they start to have more leverage over the decisions that independent people want to do with their lives should somebody that represents their interests gain power.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's, you could, given that Antifa, already kind of exists and they have been kind of used like that to disrupt anything, that goes against the establishment's agenda. And, I guess the closest thing we've had to kind of a Trump Chud army type thing is Proud Boys, which of course their leader has been thrown into jail for 20 years for not even being at Jan 6th. And yeah, so yeah, there could be, in my view, during this chaotic period that we're talking about here in my timeline, during an immigration type protests chaos event, which ties in with the Civil War, obviously, because at the beginning of this year, if you remember, when Texas was trying to put barbed wire on the border, the federal government, of course, came in and cut the barbed wire, and there was a standoff. And in that standoff, 25 states ended up standing with Texas, and of course, the remaining 25 either didn't say anything or it's presumed support for the federal government, so that it kind of perfectly painted a picture of what a civil war could look like in that regard, as far as who would be on whose team. And also ties together that, I think the immigration thing is what's going to actually cause the equivalent of Caesar's Civil War here, in terms of the chaotic event that necessitates the order that Trump could bring in and establish himself as a dictator for life type. But as far as what I see, Trump's side being, in terms of like a Chud army, if there was, during the BLM riots, we started to see, I think Kyle Rittenhouse would be the general of the Chud army there. He's pretty much the perfect example of what would rise up in a second coming of that type of civil unrest, which you can see that they don't even need these groups, looters, rioters, etc. They don't even really need they don't need a cop shooting anymore for this kind of stuff to happen. They just go on Facebook and they say, let's do a teen takeover. Let's go loot this gas station. Everybody, because they've learned during the pandemic, growing up in the pandemic, they learned, oh, if we just bring 2,000 people into one, square block, then we can loot the entire place, no consequences, much like the Purge, which in terms of predictive programming, that's something that's what I bring up a lot. Is of course what happens in the Purge. There's one night where you can put on a mask and then go commit any crimes you want with no consequences, which is exactly what we saw during the pandemic. Everybody had masks on, and there's also, of course, group psychology that goes on with wearing a mask, where you are much more susceptible because it reduces your individualism. You're more susceptible to crowd mob psychology, and you're more likely to do things uncharacteristic, say loot and attack people. And of course, Jared Kushner hired the PR guy from the Purge movies onto the White House staff. So anyways, the last Purge movie, the Forever Purge or Purge Forever, I forget what the actual title is, but it focuses, the rest of them were much more race-based. It was kind of more BLM predictive programming. This one was specifically focusing on Texas and migrants. So they basically had the migrants taking over the ranches from the spoiled rich white ranchers. They rose up and took over the land and the ranches from them.
Like a South Africa kind of situation, you could say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very similar. And yeah, so that's, that of course all ties in. And in the movie, what happens is the Purge doesn't stop. It doesn't go on for one day. Basically, it becomes the government's their paramilitary arm basically tries to maintain their power, but basically the whole country is in complete disarray, breakdown of police and all normal law and order.
I hate to interrupt. My phone is going to die in 1 second.
All right. Before you go, final thoughts.
I'm just saying I'm out of here. I don't think I'm on team. Nothing's going to happen because this military strategic situation ultimately results in effectively nothing. And honestly, all the conservatives and shit are too pussy to fucking do anything either. I really the British military doesn't even exist. The U.S. military doesn't even have any troops. Yeah, everyone's just going to be poor. The elite are going to go poor, and then people are going to go back to normal economics. And then I got some surprises for you later, but I got to go.
Oh, wait, before you go, we have damn it, I wanted to say a $5 super chat from Nachima Gluck, who says, shout out to my buddy Salmon. Glad you all are having this conversation so that I don't have to. Well, that's what BTR does, right? We take what goes on inside of people's heads, the ones that are working in corporate America, and we're actually able to voice it and to, what's very important, make sure that voice is able to be countered in a friendly way by somebody like Armand, for instance, who was here today. And that's what it's all about, Drew. We have to learn from each other, even if we come from different political perspectives, because the alternative, I think, would definitely be to have this, a jump start to this authoritarian or, God forbid, totalitarian nightmare. Yeah,
it definitely, obviously, divide and conquer is in play, and yeah. That I guess to finish my thought here before logging off, that's the immigration situation is going to be what creates the decentralized civil war type idea, and then of course Trump implements some law and order and quells it, and that's how he, just like Caesar wins the Civil War, that's going to be his equivalent in my viewpoint.
Order out of chaos. So before you go, Drew, we have $30 from King of Biltong. Good afternoon from Anton's Meat and Eat. Free shipping for your biltong using code BTR. Lev will provide the links to everyone. So yes, if you guys go to antonsusa.com, and I provided the link in the chat over here, you're going to enjoy delicious and nutritious biltong, which is South African jerky. Drew, have you ever had a biltong?
I have not. Sounds delicious.
Oh, it's very delicious. And now they even have kangaroo, which I tried out. I don't know if you've ever tried kangaroo meat out, Drew, but it's very interesting. It's got kind of a gamey taste. Personally, I really like the biltong sticks which have like this nice like layer of fat on them. You could just chew it. It's really good. But anyway, guys, I really appreciate, Drew, you being here, and Armand, and of course the great Uberboyo. And yeah, we got to keep this going. We got to make sure that there aren't going to be any echo chambers, because again, like, my whole frustration is we all have to make money, we all have to gain followers, and I want to make sure that the followers don't end up causing us to only be focused on the things that the followers like. That's going to save us in the end, to be able to take a sharp sword to that Gordian knot and be able to think clearly. And it's going to be tough, but I really appreciate the fact that you, Drew, are here and we're able to talk about this, and hopefully Armand is going to be able to learn what you talked about and vice versa and all that. So, I'm not saying anything new around here, buddy. So, guys, thank you so much for watching. Drew, what is next for you? Where can people find you?
Yep, at Drutang Reborn on Twitter, DrutangReborn. And yeah, no, you find me there, and I've got got my book American Apocalypse X, which kind of describes the situation. The first chapter of it is out digitally for people who've pre-ordered, and the rest should be printed before the election. So keep an eye out for that.
Sweet. And go to patreon.com/breaktherules, become a patron today, and you are going to get exclusive perks, Discord privileges. You are also going to get, if you are a $20 patron and live around the New York City area. I know, Drew, you're never going to set foot in New York City. I've made peace with that. But you guys are going to get an opportunity to be there live in the recording that I'm going to do with, for example, with Jason Rezagurjani, coming up in probably like a couple of weeks now, maybe 3 or 4 weeks. I'm going to have a live event with Dr. Giorgiani at my studio, and then we're going to go up to the roof and have a barbecue and have drinks and have a party. So if you want to be in on that, become a $20 patron if you're in the New York City area, patreon.com/breaktherules, as well as exclusive streams for the patrons as well, which we're going to have actually coming up in, I think, next week. We are going to have a stream, so look out for that. I think you guys are going to have a great time watching it, and once again, I really appreciate everybody being here, being who you are, doing the needful, as the sirs like to say. So, Drew, thank you very much, my friend. I really appreciate